Hi, everybody. Today is Thursday, September 18th, 2025, and our friend Tony Norfield is back with us. Welcome back.
Hi.
Tony, let's start with it's been such a long time we haven't talked to each other. Yeah. So I was wondering what's your take on what is happening in the Middle East? We had all these changes, the government in
Mhm.
Syria fall,
Mhm.
just disintegration of Assad government. We had after that the conflict, the Gaza is continuing the same way, the genocide is going on and on, and you see something different from what we've seen so far. That is the attack on Qatar and
Mhm.
the summit in the aftermath of the attack, all these countries coming together. You see Saudi Arabia getting closer to Pakistan, to Iran. They're not talking about Saudi Arabia and Iran. They're not talking about rapprochement and those sort of, let's put an end to the animosity, to the enmity. It's beyond
Mhm.
that, going forward, getting better. And Israel attacking Qatar, which is one of the most important countries for the United States in the region.
Mhm.
Donald Trump coming out saying that they're not going to do it again. And Netanyahu, hours after what Donald Trump said to the Emir of Qatar, he comes out and says, "It doesn't matter. We're going to attack you over and over again and again to get
Mhm.
what we want to get, to assassinate what we want to assassinate." Your take on what's going on in the Middle
Yeah.
East?
Um, this is probably the first kind of evident time that Israel has seen to be a liability for US policy in the region. Whereas historically, for decades now, they've relied upon the Israelis to act as a local cop and to smash down any signs of resistance. And more recently, actually under Trump version one, back in 2016 to 2020, he was attempting to get these Abraham Accords together to cement the role of Israel in the region. But the genocide in Gaza and, well, also the West Bank, one has to say, has been so completely outrageous and disgusting that even those who are basically Israeli supporters or Zionists are kind of questioning it, and it puts all of the regional Arab states in a really tricky situation because before they pretty much ignored the views of their local populations who were on the whole pro-Palestinian, and and there'd be enough repression to prevent any opposition to that. But this has come at a very macro level, if you like. It's something where if any of these Arab states, who most of them, well, I think maybe all of them, but most of them at least, have got US military bases in them and technically relying upon, US defense, against what is a bit, who are they defending again? Who's really going to attack them? Because Iran wasn't in the mode of attacking any of those countries anyway. So who is it who is going to attack them? And then it turns out, of course, that the country who attacks them is Israel. So, and then the Qatar uh, attack by Israel was most interesting because it's something that could not have been uh, left to one side by the local regional countries. That number one, there's military bases, US and British military bases in Qatar. Number two, they did nothing to stop the attacks. Number three, they actually helped the Israeli jets refuel to continue the attacks. So, if ever you want completely in black and white in big letters, these are not your friends. that would be that would be the evident thing. So I think that what it's done is led to a reassessment of what to do. I wouldn't bet on very much really happening in the next year or so, because these countries do depend upon or have depended upon so much upon US support that it's going to be difficult for them to extricate themselves from that. But the example, fairly shocking when you look at it, the Pakistan, Saudi Arabia mutual defense deal, that really kind of came out of the blue. And it's something that is significant because you would have expected the US to have stymied that or turned it into something else, just some Islamic unity thing or something like that, not a mutual defense pact. Now, what the mutual defense pact would actually mean in practice, frankly, who knows? But the mere fact of it having happened greatly politically undermines the position of the US in the region, and will no doubt make other countries, whether it be the United Arab Emirates or any of the other countries, really think twice and, well, what are we doing? As I say, because the US is so entrenched in all of the countries, it'll take a while before very much can really happen. But it's a sign of an important crack in US hegemony in the region. And it's something really that's been, well, clearly led by the Israeli attack. And that just adds to, the anger that they've got over what's happening in Gaza. So it's something I think is very important for US foreign policy, and something really they probably can't do anything about. Because, as everybody knows, 3/4, 90%, whatever, of US congressmen and senators are, on the AIPAC payroll and generally pro-Zionist anyway, even if they're not on the payroll. And that conflicts a bit these days with popular opinion in the US. There's more people who are, questioning all this support for Israel, or at the very least thinking, isn't it a bit weird when you get senior senators standing up and saying the first thing to do is defend Israel and, having Israeli flags outside your office and all that kind of stuff. So it's something that you don't need to be pro-Palestinian even. You can just be a straightforward American nationalist, America first type person and think, what the hell is going on here? So all of this has opened up really quite an important set of factors that I think will cause big trouble for US policy in the region. I wouldn't go too far on that simply because, as I say, these countries are heavily entrenched into the US military and everything else. And it's only when we see more efforts, as has been made already, I think, by Pakistan, they get, some reports say about 80% of their weaponry they now get from China. And one or two other countries will be diversifying a bit anyway. So, but we're seeing this kind of change, which if it starts impacting the Gulf countries, and probably at some point Egypt as well, then that would be a serious kind of political shift. It wouldn't of itself do that much about what's happening in Gaza and what's happening in the West Bank. The slaughter continues, and the most you'll see, I think, is next week, is in the UN General Assembly. There'll be a vote on recognizing Palestine, and that's very likely to go ahead. But so far, as I say, that there's no real thing to stop what Israel is doing, namely genocide in Gaza, despite all of the opposition, despite UN commissions saying various things, and everyone else doing that as well. So unfortunately, I don't think it would change much on the ground, but it is a sign that the policy followed by the US is becoming more of an evident liability for them.
Tony, we had, in addition to what is happening later, before that, even we had the attack between the first time the two countries in the Middle East, Iran and Israel, attacking each other. Israel attacked Iran, and they wanted to do regime change in Iran.
Yeah,
and it was somehow a surprise attack on the part of Iranians because they didn't expect the attack coming while they were negotiating with the United States. Israel has decided, Donald Trump knew about it. They have tried to do everything to facilitate, to somehow trap Iranian in some sort of comfort that there would be no attack on them. That's why it was somehow in the initial hours they were so successful in terms of putting pressure, a lot of pressure on the Iranian government, and many commanders were killed during the attack. Many civilians were killed. The official reports from Iran shows that 800, 900 civilians were killed. But after all, to put an end to the war, the United States has decided to interfere because they perceive that Israel is losing. That's why they have to interfere. What is Israel today, in your opinion, in the mind of, because before, just imagine what Israel was in the mind of the people in the Middle East. Israel was so much powerful militarily because they said that we have the technology, we have the weapon, we have the science, we have everything here at our disposal when we can use it against you. But you see the genocide in Gaza, you see the way they attack Yemen, they attack Iran, and I would argue they have been defeated in all of these fronts. Even in Gaza, they couldn't defeat Hamas. What is the outcome of what Israel has done so far to the mind of those people, in your opinion, in the Middle East, and how is it going to influence the region?
Well, I think it's on two levels really, because on a more popular level, I think people can see what you just said, that that Israel has not managed to defeat Hamas, it's not managed to stop Yemen, and and it's had all kinds of problems, and more news is coming out every week really about how much damage the Iranian attacks did, whereas previously it had been censored quite a lot, although a lot of people guess what really happened. So I think on a popular level, it's kind of made the whole idea of calling Israel an entity rather than a state, and a transitional kind of entity, a blot on the system, cancer in the region, that kind of thing. It's probably strengthened those ideas, but it hasn't really had that much effect, except this latest thing in Saudi Arabia with at a kind of more governmental ruling level, and that would take far longer, because I think those countries, they've stepped out of the Western orbit a little bit, by joining BRICS, for example, or maybe wanting to get involved in the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, doing deals with China, or even the Saudis selling oil to China in renminbi, not in US dollars, that kind of thing. So there's a number of instances where these governments are already kind of stepping out of the Western bloc in order really to hedge their bets. You don't have to believe that they're underneath it all, they're good people, or anything like that. They're just hedging their bets as a country, thinking, how do we gain economic, political security, And it's pretty clear that one side of the equation that we relied upon completely, namely the US and the Western Bloc, is a real liability. They can't offer anything. And, they're promoting this destructive force of Israel on all of us. But I think what it will be, though, is, say, you've got the two levels. You've got a popular level, which is, in any case, already was kind of, anti-Zionist, and now will be even more vehemently so. That in itself doesn't necessarily have that much effect upon government policies in the region. But just from a realpolitik point of view, the governments in the region will be looking to hedge their bets, and they better kind of step away from this, because the whole thing could crumble. And where are they going to stand? And in this, I think this partly explains Iran's response to the Israeli attacks, back in, I think it was June, wasn't it? That I was annoyed and surprised that they stopped after the 10, 11 days or so, thinking that they could easily have finished this, really. And I don't know whether part of their calculation was not simply that if they went much further, were they being directly threatened by the US, for some big, massive military attack. That probably was the case. But they also probably didn't want to completely disrupt everything in the region, and hoping that they could, build up relations more generally with the other countries. And the problem is that, to look at the divisions in Islam, you've got, they're basically this Shia country is the only one standing against them, standing against Israel, and all the rest, all the Sunni-backed ones are on the side of the West, effectively. So it's going to be a long process before they can really get much progress on this. But I think it's underway. And when you look at Israel itself, I think they got downgraded in credit rating terms. For God's sake, it's a long time coming. This was some months ago. But their economy is in a big mess. Their military is in a big mess. There've been lots of suicides and people leaving, and et cetera, et cetera. So there's a whole lot of trouble that they've got, and none of the announced objectives of the Israelis, of the Netanyahu government, have got anywhere. And because it's such a fragile system, it's not as if they can push Netanyahu to one side and put someone else in charge who then looks acceptable, because they're all in the same mode. They all want to slaughter everyone in Gaza and the West Bank, and ethnic cleansing and all the rest of it. So it's not as if there's anyone else who could be put in place who is kind of a soft alternative to Netanyahu or anything like that. So it's going to be a long time coming, unfortunately. But I think these are steps along the way to the disintegration of the Israeli entity, and they're already being boycotted by many more countries worldwide. It's shown up, as I've indicated on occasion, when you look at shipping transit going to and from Israel, it's collapsed and it hasn't recovered. Whereas normally you would expect there to be some kind of recovery after a crisis. There hasn't really been a recovery. And this, as I say, is a slow process. And by itself, it doesn't help out Gaza at all. That doesn't really do much to stop the annexations in the West Bank either, or all the other things that the Israelis are up to. But whereas a couple of months ago, you could have said that the Israeli plans are now coming to fruition, and they're still promoting this idea of the Gaza Riviera, turning ethnic cleansing into a real estate project, basically. But these plans now look far more fragile, and it's more the case that like Western investors wouldn't want to go there because they would see, even from a popular opinion point of view, that there's enough of a boycott mentality to prevent getting engaged that much with the Israelis. So it's the beginnings of a disintegration, but it's only the beginnings, unfortunately.
Tony, one of the main issues today with Europe is the situation in Ukraine, and Donald Trump is somehow he's trying to do something with the case of Ukraine because he's not happy with the case of Ukraine. After all, it doesn't matter how the establishment in the United States is totally, trying to push for the continuation of the conflict. But when it comes to Europe, how do you see Europe today? I'm talking about the most important countries in the western part of Europe: United Kingdom, Germany, and France. These three countries are so much important for the decision of the Europe in Ukraine. It seems that they want Ukraine. They know that the case of Ukraine is passing away, but they're trying to make some sort of continuous problem for Russia in that region, even in the western part of Ukraine. Something like Idlib, something what has happened in Syria. They created that city supported by Turkey and feeding these radical Islamists in Idlib. Then and after that, that Assad government has decided to just disintegrate on because they didn't fight back. Assad just left Syria, and you don't see any sort of direct confrontation between the Syrian army and these forces, these radicals in Idlib. It seems to me that the case of Ukraine is somehow turning to be the same as we had in Syria. They feel that they can inflict tremendous suffering on Russia as time goes by. What is your understanding on the policies in Ukraine?
I think it's a fair summary of what they want to do, but of course, Russia is not Syria. It's in a far stronger position militarily, politically, ideologically, and with plenty of international support from outside the West, of course. But it's got China, India, even Turkey is kind of helping out a bit, although Turkey is often stabbing in the back as well. So I think that the policy for Europe, they must realize basically that Ukraine cannot win. It doesn't matter how many weapons they give them, well, they haven't got enough people. And there was a recent prisoner exchange, which was, about 90-1 or something. There's something like or at least I can't remember. The ratio is very big anyway. That Russia handed over, 50 Russia handed over about 1,000 dead bodies or something, and Ukraine could only hand over like 50 or 100 or something. So the outcome, though, is still some months away. I mean, I'd hope that this would be over a long time ago, but no. And I think it's still some good months away. Partly, as I pointed out, and so have others, that there are still bits of the 4 regions that Russia took, which are not under Russian control. That's Zaporizhia and Kherson, and a bit of Donetsk. They've basically got all of Lugansk. So that's the 4 regions which, as an absolute minimum, they need to have. then Russia has tried to do a kind of security zone or a buffer zone on the eastern border of Ukraine, around Sumy and Kharkov, and they've done it to some extent, but there's still some way to go. And so far, the Russians have made no real attempt on Odessa. And I think Odessa is going to be the key issue, because Odessa is a major port, or at least it could be and was. And it's also at the center of French and British plans for embedding themselves in Ukraine. So the British want to, organize Ukrainian maritime security from Odessa, and the French, no doubt, doing stuff along those lines as well, and wanting to get control of economic resources. They haven't done it yet, and they're reluctant to actually send in any troops. So this whole coalition of the willing thing isn't nonsense, really. They won't really be sending any troops. But until Russia takes Odessa, or makes it very clear that it's not going to be under any Western control, then I think that this war will continue. And the Russians can say that, and they've said on many occasions that we will not accept NATO troops of any kind in Western Ukraine. But because they've taken it relatively easy in the past couple of years, and they've done some attacks on French troops who've been kind of undercover. They've gone and hit an area where they've been accumulated, but they haven't done it in an overt way that, you come one step here, then bang, you're dead. They've made the rhetorical political statements, and it's not entirely clear that the West, namely really Britain and France, whether they entirely believe them. So that's still a bit up in the air, and I think we're going to have to see a more definite move by Russia to smash down on any Western intervention into Western Ukraine. It leaves longer term the tricky business of what the hell do you do when you have a large proportion of the West Ukraine population being anti-Russian. That's not true for most of the center and the east. So Russia can take them without too much hassle, I think. But when it comes to areas around Lvov and, west of Kiev, effectively, then it's a problem. So how do they handle that? So that's when the longer term issues of, do these regions get taken over by Hungary, Romania, and Poland? And that's entirely possible. But again, these are things many steps down the line, and it's probably next year rather than anything in the coming months before that's done.
Tony, during the SCO summit in China, we've learned about Siberia 2 pipeline. And this pipeline was supposed to go to Europe to provide Europe with energy, and is going to China instead of Europe. Mm-hmm. How do you see the future of Europe without Russian energy, without Russian oil coming to Europe? And how can they replace the Russian energy? I don't know who else going to be able to provide Europe with the quantity of energy, the quantity of oil that oil and gas they need in Europe.
They could get it, but it's get it at what price? Because the Russian gas through Nord Stream was very cheap for them, because once you've got the pipe in place, the actual transit costs are very low, and the unit cost of the extra kind of cubic meter of gas is peanuts, really. But if you're importing from the Middle East, from Qatar, from the UAE, or if you're importing from the US, then you're going to pay much higher prices. Certainly, if you're turning your gas into liquefied natural gas, then you've got processing costs as well as the transit costs, and that means that the underlying gas price anyway is several times higher for the Europeans than it is in the US. And anything coming from the Middle East is also a problem for them. And, with the Red Sea blockade in particular, it makes it even more expensive. It's got to go all the way around Africa. So I think that Europe could get the energy resources, but it means at a high price, and it makes them uncompetitive. So what has happened in practice, and you see this more or less on a weekly basis, is that, and this has become more blatant and evident with Trump's statements, because he doesn't hide any of this, whereas like Biden might have put some gloss over it. But he's saying, come to the US. You've got all these wonderful things, invest in the wonderful US market, that kind of thing. So that's what's been happening. A number of German companies and European companies are thinking, or have already done, moving some production facilities into the United States. German industry is collapsing. British industry, there wasn't much of it to begin with, and it's even less now. So, you find industrial production numbers really weak in all of these countries. And what it does as a backdrop, it creates a real big economic problem for, in particular, say, Britain, France, and Germany. So if they want to get on the anti-Russia bandwagon and rearmament and everything like this, well, how are you going to afford it? And already, I think today there was a huge demonstration in Paris and probably throughout France, anti-Macron and anti-spending money on Ukraine and cutting back on welfare services. And this kind of thing is a broader issue in European politics. And the interesting thing is how it's only really being taken up by parties who would be called right-wing or, semi-fascist or something like this. They're the ones causing a big fuss about this, whereas the more middle-of-the-road parties or the regular conservative parties are going along with the previous policies. But it means, though, that the Alliance for Deutschland in Germany, Le Pen's party in France, and the Reform lot in the UK generally get a lot more support compared to the established political parties. So it basically means that the end result, to cut a long story short, is economic stagnation, which they can't really escape, humiliating dependence upon the US, which doesn't even hide the fact it's smirking up its sleeve at, what a bunch of idiots they are, but we've got them over a barrel. And it means that it creates all kinds of political tension in their countries. How that will play out is difficult to say. I think, as I've mentioned, some time ago when we spoke, that the problem is the existing political ruling class in Europe, exemplified by people like von der Leyen, and Kaja Kallas and people like that. But also you got, Merz, Macron, and Starmer. They're all saying the same things that they've all said for months and months. So it's not as if they've really changed their tune. And there's no sign of them changing their tune at all. The anti-Russia stuff, Russia is a big threat, we need to rearm, all of that is still going ahead strongly. And they are doing it. A lot of people laugh at European rearmament, and it seems kind of silly. They haven't got the industrial backdrop. But when you have about 20 odd countries, they do have the industrial backdrop. A bit here and a bit there, and it's, not a big unified system. Not like China, you want to produce 1 million drones a week, you can, that kind of thing. But they're all doing a bit of it, and they've all built it up quite a lot. And they've all been doing endless exercise in the Baltic Sea, and trying to do stuff in the Black Sea as well, and anywhere else for that matter. So the Europeans are rearming. It's a stupid, disastrous course to follow, because to think that Russia's going to back down is just ridiculous. Russia will not back down until it gets what it needs out of the Ukraine war, basically. So that's still the situation. So it hasn't yet got bad enough for Ukraine for them to completely give up. They've revised their views a bit to more or less think, as you were mentioning at the beginning, that we could have some kind of European security cordon in the west of Ukraine. So they're hanging on to that as a possibility to keep something going, but even that would not be accepted, basically, by Russia, and I think they'd take actions to prevent that from happening.
To me, Tony, the militarization of Europe is totally the waste. It's totally a waste of time and energy, and even destroying the future of Europe. Because after all, unless they want to do something in Ukraine, because there is nothing coming out of militarization of Europe. How are they going to benefit from this militarization? Who's going to attack them? Who's going to threaten them? Russia is not willing to do that. Russia is not. The problem of Ukraine is something different from Europe. Europe doesn't that much. It's not that much important for Russia, because look at the NATO expansion. They came to the Russia's border, to the Russia's frontier, at the doorstep of Russia. That's why they interfered in Ukraine. But when it comes to even Poland, Romania, all of these European countries, they don't even care about Finland. The case of Finland is somehow important for Russia, in my opinion, after all, because they have a common border. But even with the case of Finland, they try to politically talk, they try to politically manage the situation so far. So the militarization of Europe is totally against the future of Europe. It's totally against the prosperity of Europe. Yep. Unless they want to do something big in Ukraine, that would bring a nuclear war, in my opinion, if they go in that direction.
That's the logic, indeed, that basically we're heading down the path where Russia would not do the nuclear option as a starter. Even tactical nukes, they wouldn't do that. At least I don't think so. But their policy is, if there is a threat to the existence of the Russian state, then they would use nuclear power. Nuclear weapons. This is, an absurd policy. Actually, not absurd, because you can explain it. It's basically they see their position in the world as being, part of the post-war hegemony gang, essentially. So the G7, apart from Japan, all the rest of the US and Europe. So they're all part of this kind of imperial club. And so when you found a couple of years ago, von der Leyen talking about, this threat to our way of life from Russia, and you think, what? What's going on? Well, what she means is that if there's a crack in the privileges and hegemony of Western Europe, then that's a real problem, because it then means that they can't go strutting around the world telling people what to do. And the difficulty they have now, which has been coming on for the last 20 odd years, is that economically they're far more backward, compared to China, which is racing ahead in all fields. Militarily, they're pretty backward as well. And all they've got is this sense of privilege that they want to uphold. And they're promoting this with an anti-Russia kind of thrust. And it's made worse in a way by the Baltic states, who the only thing they have to sell is Russophobia. The Polish haven't liked Russia for quite a long time, so they're joining in on that stuff too. But you do see cracks. So there's some cracks maybe in Greece, certainly in Slovakia and Hungary, and in Austria as well. They're not entirely happy with the whole NATO expansion and everything like this. So anyone with a realistic assessment of what's going on sees what a disastrous policy this is. And if you travel around different European countries, you see there's not much to write home about, frankly. Like countries like Italy look more like, okay, good at fashion, yes, but the fashion is made in Asia. Or you're good at this design, yes, but many of the products are made somewhere else. And other than that, what have you got to sell? Tourism. So you rely upon old monuments and things like this to attract tourists, which is an absurd kind of economic policy, really. But they've had no policy at all. I remember I went to a big European conference on technology back in 2019, I think it was, 2018 or 19. And it became clear that they were worried about the US because the domination of the big US tech companies, Apple, Facebook, and, all the computer stuff. And they were worried about China, which is clearly growing very dramatically, but they had nothing to offer. And here they have, the 19, 20 countries, many different languages, different kind of, despite the so-called single market, there are many divisions and differences within them regarding professional qualifications and things like this. And yeah, they've got nothing really to offer, frankly. There's the odd company here and there that's done well, but then they've found that the US has put blocks on what they can do. The ASML, the Dutch monopoly producer of extreme ultraviolet lithography machines, can't sell to China now. Why is that? Was that a Dutch decision? Well, no, it's an American decision forced on the Dutch. So you get things like this where they don't have any political independence to back up an economic strength and independence either. So, there's only one way for them to go, which is down, frankly.
Tony, before wrapping up, we had the case of Charlie Kirk being assassinated in the United States, and Donald Trump came out and put the blame on the left, radical left. And you had the same sort of rhetoric from the vice president of the United States. And looking at today's West, and how do you find the right and left? Is there anything right and left in the society, in your opinion?
These terms are pretty meaningless, frankly. They date ironically from the French Revolution, when it was the left and right side of the assembly in France. The most that left used to mean, in terms of people who made it to government at least, was some state intervention, state control, welfare spending, things like this. So that was so-called left, whereas the so-called right were more arguably free market, but then the free market always meant subsidies for private companies. So it wasn't that free after all. And one of the problems is that much political discourse is completely polluted by American blabbing. These are the people, the American Republicans, calling Obama a Marxist, for example, that a few years ago now, but, like the radical left and what are you talking about? These radical lefts, most of them are also pro-Zionist, like Bernie Sanders and people like that. Or Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, I think I've got her name right, and so the Zionist kind of American nationalist, put America first, all that kind of stuff. What's kind of radical left about them? And then if they want to look at groups outside that, whether it be protesters, demonstrators, whatever. There aren't that many of them, actually. And some of the bigger demonstrations have been, people loaded up with guns, rifles, machine guns, even, who are right wing. You couldn't say they were left wing. I think that the Charlie Kirk killing, still really proper news on that to come out. There's a lot of odd things about it, of course. Anything from funny hand signals from the bodyguards at the back of the stage to this guy who wanted to pretend he did it in order to let the perpetrator escape. So there's all this kind of like weird stuff. But the real backdrop is an atomized, extremely violent society where getting a gun out and killing someone is kind of a normal thing to do. Well, I'm exaggerating, but basically the murder rate in the US is pretty high anyway. And, not all of those murders would be called assassinations, but they, but in a political sense, they would be an assassination. It's not just murdering someone for money or something, no, it's something which the interesting angle I would say, just as a final point, is that a lot of people are pinning it to something Israel did. I've got no idea. I look at all the various rumors and stories about that, and you could make a case that they had an interest in getting rid of him because he was turning against supporting Israel so vehemently. But the fact that it's become an issue in public internet type discourse is, I think, an interesting sign of how there's probably more of an anti-Israeli, maybe not anti-Zionist, but kind of not liking the idea that there's a great deal of influence over everything in the US run by the Israelis, basically. And that seems to be infecting quite a lot of the MAGA crowd, apart from anyone else in the US. So I think that's symptomatically an interesting angle on maybe a small political shift in a popular sense among the US population against the kind of pro-Israel mantra that there's been for decades.
Thank you so much, Tony, for being with us today.
Yeah.
Great pleasure as always.
Yeah, thanks very much.
See you soon. Bye-bye.
Bye.